Hello, welcome to Park Media. I'm your host, Vince Emanuele, and today we're speaking with friend of the program and of the space, Christian Parenti. He is an associate professor of economics at John Jay College, City University of New York. He is the author of Lockdown America, The Soft Cage, and Tropic of Chaos, among others. He has written for Fortune, Mother Jones, Playboy, New York Times, London Review of Books, and many other publications. Today we are talking about his forthcoming book, Radical Hamilton. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's good to see you.
We appreciate it, man. So tell us a little bit about the thinking behind writing this book. I know you've been working on it for many years now. Talk to us about how this came about and why you wrote this book.
Well, it began by mistake. Unlike every other book I've written, I read for fun. I read Ron Chernow's biography of Hamilton, and it was interesting. And there were hints in there of like this kind of statist economics, and they weren't very developed. I mean, the book is, his book is like a gossipy sort of biography. So I sort of explored around because I was interested in this idea. I mean, I've long been interested in the idea of the role of government, of the state within capitalism, as a repressive force, but also as a force that reproduces the private sector. And I've become increasingly concerned with and interested in and aware of the really essential role of government as the life support system that produces capitalism. Right? It's not something that capitalism emerges and then has this relationship with the state, and sometimes the state helps out, but like increasingly I'm seeing capital and the private sector as very much conjured by the state. So I was interested in that element of the story of Hamilton, and I started poking around in the literature and saw not much on that. And then also saw misrepresentations around it. And saw these references to the report on manufacturers. And then so I read the report on manufacturers, and I started using it in classes because it became clear that nobody read the report on manufacturers, which is Hamilton's essentially magnum opus, in which he lays down a kind of roadmap for a developmentalist project. And then the idea was, this should go into print. I was like, so I approached Verso. I said, maybe we should, reprint this book, and I'll write an introduction. I wrote an article for Jacobin, and I was like, take that article, use that as the basis of, some sort of like introduction to the report on manufacturers. And the introduction grew and grew, and became essentially a book, and then became a long book. So we're like, okay, the report it'll be the introduction, and then I was like, no, well, it'll be a book, but then the report will be the appendix. So the book would sort of be half my writing and half of it the report, and then it just became too long for the report to even be an appendix, and then it became so long really had to cut a bunch of words out of it. So now I think it's nice and tight generally.
I agree.
Yeah, that's how we got it.
So there's a section in chapter 1 where you sort of talk about why Hamilton's ideas concerning the, quote, real economy are ignored. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, partly because they do not comport with the neoliberal laissez-faire ideology that is totally dominant in economics and many other social sciences, and is the kind of background knowledge of the set of assumptions that a lot of the pundit class operate with. He actually opens the report on manufacturers with an attack on Adam Smith. And this is why it's never read and why it's not in print. I mean, it's out there on the internet, and there's old copies of it around. But I mean, the reason people don't delve into it is because if you actually delve into what Hamilton thought about economic development, it opens with attacking Adam Smith and the idea that markets are self-regulating and that competition operates, to essentially produce equilibrium and positive outcomes for all, as if the economy is being guided by an invisible hand. Hamilton slaps that down immediately and explicitly, and he basically says that that's okay if you're already a developed economy, if you're the UK. But if you are, to put it in modern language, it's not the language he uses. He says, but in our situation, but he basically says, look, if you're an underdeveloped economy, if you're an economy of the periphery that's dependent on agricultural exports, and you want to develop your economy, you cannot do it through laissez-faire economics. The market will not deliver the outcomes that are desired. And what is needed is a state that will take responsibility for guiding a process of economic development. And the reason Hamilton was into that, his concern was national survival. It's strange to imagine this now in the United States being so powerful and developed as it is, but there was a very real possibility that the country would be broken into pieces, that it would be reconquered. Early on in the book, I compare Hamilton with Simón Bolívar, and there's I think there's an implicit kind of assumption sometimes that Latin America ended up as this kind of fragmented group of countries that are economically in various stages of underdevelopment. Underdevelopment, not meaning not developed, but meaning developed through the peripheral relationships of global capitalism, right? Being that side of this geographic equation of core and periphery from which, low value added primary commodities, raw materials are exported, right? I mean, Latin America, there's been industrialization in Latin America, but not as much as many Latin American progressives and nationalists have wanted throughout the centuries. And I think a lot of people say, well, that's the way things were always going to be in Latin America, but it wasn't inevitable there. And conversely, it was not at all inevitable that the United States was destined to become an industrial powerhouse with a strong and diversified economy and a very strong state. Now, I don't like a lot of what this state and this economy is about, but my point is more technical, which is that this entity was not inevitable. It was the product of a political struggle. And there was, at the heart, in the beginning of the revolution, there was real questions over whether or not that was going to happen. So Hamilton was very concerned that the country would break into pieces, that it would remain trapped in what we would call underdevelopment. It would be economically reconquered and probably militarily reconquered. And he thought the only way to avoid that would be to have a strong army and navy. And the only way to achieve that would be to have a wealthy economy. And the only way to achieve that would be to industrialize, though he didn't use that term. He talked about shifting from an agricultural economy to an economy based on manufactures. And the only way to do that was to throw out the rules offered by Adam Smith about letting the market take its course, and to instead step in, intervene, and get prices wrong. Don't let the price signal determine everything, and to plan, to subsidize, to protect, to plan, to pick winners, to have an economic plan and pursue it so as to arrive at industrialization, which would then would increase labor productivity and just increase the wealth of the economy. And that would provide the tax base for the state. And he also wanted a centralized state, not a fragmented sovereignty of a bunch of little states, as was very much the Southern view, not just on the eve of the Civil War, but even back at the founding of the country. And he wanted a strong central state that could then have a strong army to project power internally and externally. And for better and for worse, that was achieved. But it was not inevitable.
Toward the end of chapter 1, you mention Karl Polanyi's book, The Great Transformation. This is one of Sergio's favorite books. I've actually never read it, and it was funny, the day that I received the manuscript, a friend of ours dropped the book off at our front door to return it back to Sergio. I brought it up to the apartment, and then next thing you know, I'm finishing chapter 1 of your manuscript, and you're mentioning it. Can you talk about a little bit about how this plays a role You write, Polanyi understood that no society, even our own, has ever been totally governed by the rules of the market. Hamilton agreed, but faced considerable opposition from those who benefited from the agrarian economy. And you consistently, throughout the first half of the book, and I'm assuming probably in the second, draw a contrast between Jefferson and Hamilton. Can you talk a little bit about this before we get into Hamilton's life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Polanyi's argument was, one of his arguments was that, from that free market economics were a dangerous utopian idea. They were dangerous because they were utopian. The idea of a self-regulating market was insane. And the idea of a market society, a society that could be governed by the rules of the market. Right? This is the fantasy of the Koch brothers style libertarians of today, of the Hayekian school of Austrian economics. But it goes back further than that. And from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there were elites who were pushing against taxation and any sort of restriction on their power. And so Polanyi, they push the ideas of Ricardo and Adam Smith and others, that free markets are best. And Polanyi's argument was that inevitably what happens is that the idea of laissez-faire wins certain victories. And in winning these victories, deregulating markets, they create crises, which then require the emergency response of the public sector. And so one of his lines is that laissez-faire was planned and planning was spontaneous, that there's this pattern of crisis that's born partly out of, the business cycle, the boom and bust cycle of capitalism, but also that there's a class project of sort of rebellion against the state that comes from the bourgeoisie, from the ruling class, the owning class. And they inevitably get certain victories, and it is those very victories that cause problems for them, and it is those problems that summon the state back in. So we saw an example of this. We're living through it right now with COVID.
Right.
But we saw a very clear example of this with the crash of 2008. That was a direct result of 25, 30 years of lobbying to deregulate banking. Finally, Bill Clinton deregulates banking, gets rid of the Glass-Steagall Act. That's in 1997 or 98. And, 20 years later, there's a massive crash. And you have a bunch of hardcore free market economists in the Bush administration suddenly nationalizing the banks. They were, using socialistic tools, not to produce socialism, but to save capitalism. So this pattern happens again and again, right? It's the victories of the free market fanatics that produce the crises, which then summon in these socialistic responses. And we've got to get beyond that cycle. But anyway, so that's the point from Polanyi that I was drawing on. And Hamilton, what Hamilton was aware of is that the state didn't just have to respond to economic conditions, but could create them, and that the state could really totally transform economies, could guide economies, could build economies. And the one he built was not a socialist economy by any means, but it was produced. American capitalism was, industrial American capitalism was produced very much with kind of, statist, semi-socialistic tools. I forgot the other part of the question. Oh, so the Jefferson-Hamilton thing. Jefferson embodied, and his thought still to some extent embodies an element in sort of Southern elite thinking. Not all Southerners shared this view. Chief Justice John Marshall, for example, was a Virginia Federalist. There were Southerners who were in favor of a kind of a developmentalist state. Henry Clay very much picks up the mantle of the kind of Hamiltonian agenda after Hamilton. But the majority of Southern elites had a kind of small government ideology. And that was, I argue in the book, fundamentally, rooted in a fear of what a strong central state would do to slavery.
Right.
So at the beginning of, even at the founding convention, at the Constitutional Convention, not at the Declaration of Independence, but there is a debate about the slave trade and how long it should last. And it was John Randolph, I think, spacing on his name, who says, morality has nothing to do with this. The question is whether or not the southern states will even be in this union. And if you start pressing on the slave question, we'll leave. He was from South Carolina. So from the very beginning, there was this concern among southern elites that they would be impinged upon by a strong federal government. So they opposed it. And Jefferson embodied that. And so, we can get into this more as we go on. If you want to do this through.
Yeah, because it'll eventually come up several times in the coming chapters. So in chapter 2, you sort of lay out the context in which Hamilton came to his conclusions regarding the state and economy. Most of Hamilton's views were shaped by his experiences during the Revolutionary War and the critical period which followed. So talk to us a little bit about Hamilton's origins. He's orphaned, eventually working as a shipping clerk, but quickly recognized for his intellectual prowess and work ethic. Hamilton's education is interrupted by the Revolution. Talk to us about the 3 primary grievances that drove the revolutionary fervor, as you put it. So this is British monopoly, westward expansion, and slavery, but also a little bit about Hamilton coming up in this context.
Yeah. So, Hamilton is born in the Caribbean, and he was, as John Adams put it, the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. So he was, not well-to-do. His mother was abandoned, and he went to work at age 13. He was very, very smart. He was born on St. Nevis, or Nevis, not St. Nevis, I guess it's called. And he gets a job, and his mother dies when he's like 13. So he has to get a job. All he inherits are like 3 books, and he gets a job in a shipping company and is very good at doing the books and, correspondences and managing this business. And he starts writing, as a young teenager, essays for the island's press, and some of the notables on the island see like this kid is really, really smart. And so they take up a collection to send him to the mainland to go to a prep school of some sort briefly, and then off to King's College, which is now Columbia. So he enrolls in Columbia, or what's then King's College, and it's around that time that the Revolutionary War is beginning. And so he gets caught up in the fervor of the war. And at first his politics are very similar to Jefferson's, so sort of like, democracy and freedom and all these ideas about the project of development and a strong state and sort of, a critique of laissez-faire political economy. All that stuff is in the future. First, he's just, caught up in the sort of colonialist resistance to the British control. And part of what's going on is that the British have gone through this really brutal war, the French and Indian War, as it's known in the U.S., the 7 Years' War, which took 9 years to fight, which takes place in all over the world. There are naval engagements in the Indian Ocean between the French and the English. And that conflict is actually started when a young colonial Virginian British militia officer, George Washington, gets into a firefight with some basically, French soldiers embedded with Native Americans. And that's the whole thing spins out of control. And what was going on was that Washington and his militia and a surveying party were on the other side of the Appalachians in territory that the French claimed. So that war was very expensive. And then the British Empire, the British said, well, we were protecting these colonies. I mean, if we hadn't been there fighting the French all over the planet, then you guys would all be subject to French rule. So you have to pay up. So taxes were quite strict. And the British also imposed, beginning in the early 1600s, what were called the Navigation Acts, which were rules that limited the course of capitalist development in the colonies. For example, the American colonies provided lots and lots of beaver pelts, as most people know, which were crucial in hat making. But the hat making guilds and businesses of the UK wanted that trade for themselves. And so they made it illegal for colonists to export finished hats. So there was stuff like that. There were like iron foundries were begun and then shut down. So there was actually this kind of like this pressure to block economic development in the colonies. So that infuriated a rising class of capitalists and merchants who were investing in this, small workshop capitalists, also a kind of, proto-proletariat of like mechanics, people who didn't have land, but, had skills and sold their labor, and wanted to, get better at developing these finished products and exporting them. And there was also the threat to slavery, because there's the Somerset case in 1773 in which a planter from the Caribbean comes to the UK with a slave, his manservant, his butler, as it were, who's literate and is given sort of certain freedoms. And this guy comes into contact with abolitionists in the UK who tell him, say, it's illegal. They're like, you're not a slave. Like, slavery was outlawed in England I forget when it was, but it was like in the 1100s, or maybe it was the 1200s. So slavery is not legal here. And so this case went all the way up through the British courts, and the British courts ruled that indeed in England there was no slavery. So if you were a slave in the Caribbean and you came to England, you were free. And this might not seem like that big a deal, but for these very powerful and wealthy planters, you got to remember some of these colonists. For example, John Lorenz's father. John Lorenz is a very close friend, possibly a lover of Hamilton's. His father, Henry Lorenz, who is president of the Continental Congress for a while, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, or at least of the Constitution, was the biggest slave owner in South Carolina, a major slave dealer, major rice planter, and was one of the wealthiest people in the British Empire, period. So you've got that type of person being told that they can't bring their trusted manservant with them. And it was like, it was threatening. And so they didn't like where this was going. So there were an element of this Southern elites who were like, wait a minute, this central authority in England is imposing all sorts of rules that while they didn't necessarily care about limiting nascent industrial production in the Northeast, they didn't like the idea that it starts with no slavery in England, but where does it go next? How long will it take until it comes to South Carolina? And then the other key thing was that speculators, farmers, poor people, this kind of cross-class alliance of settlers wanted to go over the Appalachian Mountains and settle that land. They wanted to possess it. And one of the results of the French and Indian War was the proclamation line of 1763 that basically made the ridge line of the Appalachian Mountains. That was the point beyond which British settlement in the American colonies could not proceed any further, that they had to stay out of there. And the fear was that if settlers kept going into these native lands, they would inevitably provoke another war with France, and the UK had bigger fish to fry and didn't want to deal with that. And the settlers wanted that land, and they wanted to throw that kind of control off.
And then in this context, you have Hamilton and his fellow students form a militia, and this is in about 1776. Hamilton is commissioned to lead an artillery company. And talk to us about Hamilton's quick rise through the ranks, his reputation on the battlefield, and eventual connection with George Washington.
Yeah. So the revolution begins in Boston. There's the fighting at Concord. In New York, there's no fighting, but Hamilton and his fellow students form a militia. They're training, and the British eventually come down to New York, and the fighting takes off there. George Washington has gone up to New England in the beginning of the war and is commanding the troops up there. And so Hamilton is at first an artillery officer. And the way things worked in the Continental Army, in many of these armies that were sort of only half modern, was that officers had to raise their own funds to equip their troops. And so Hamilton was good at raising money. And so that also, he began to make connections with elites, and he obviously had that from his island upbringing, know how to connect with the wealthy and the powerful. He was an artillery officer, which involved a lot of mathematics, and he was good at that, and he was very valiant. They guarded the retreat frequently of the British, because the British land in Staten Island, and then they invade into Brooklyn, and they fight the Continental Army, push them off Brooklyn into Manhattan, up out of Manhattan, across the Hudson River and down, and then chase them down into New Jersey. So all the way along, Hamilton is in the rear, guarding the retreat with the cannon, and he comes to the attention of numerous officers, and he's asked to join the staff of several different generals, and he holds off until Washington asks him, and then he realizes that even though Hamilton is really has suicidal tendencies and is glory obsessed and really wants to be in battle, he realized that this would be a great opportunity. So he joins Washington's staff, and that meant he was not going to be commanding troops. He was not going to be on the front lines. He was going to be one of the managers of the logistics of the war and of the strategy of the war. And the two are very bound up together, right? The logistics, the economics are part and parcel of the tactics and the strategy. And in that position, he begins to get a sense of what the problem is that this whole revolutionary experiment faces. And the problem is a sort of a tendency towards centrifugal disorganization. So the Articles of Confederation, which are, I should have reminded myself of all these dates before we did this interview, but I was struggling to save our MA program at John Jay, and we have been successful. Get a little plug for the Master's of Economics program at John Jay College in New York.
Right on.
Orthodox economics. But anyway, so the exact dates of the Articles of Confederation, 1776, or maybe it's 75, I forget. This is, the original constitution of the United States, as it were, of these rebellious colonies. And it's really just a kind of mutual aid pact. It produces a central body, which is Congress, the Continental Congress. But Congress doesn't even have the power to tax. It can request from the states that they tax. So it will essentially ask the state governments for, to pony up. And then it's up to the states. And very often the states would not pony up. Or they would do stuff like, send equipment or cloth and say, well, this is just for the Pennsylvania troops. And, and the army was connected to Congress, and Hamilton is at the center of the army. And he's realizing how potentially dangerous this loose alliance of these 13 colonies is. And Vermont is a piece of New York at that time, but it considers itself independent and has its own regiments, but it's only 13 sort of recognized political entities. And amidst all this, there is Hamilton goes through an interesting intellectual transformation. There is, after the Battle of Saratoga in, help me out here, Vince, was that 1777, right?
77, I believe, yes.
Yeah. There's finally a victory against a force. So the British have invaded through New York, and then another force is coming down from Canada. There'd been an earlier invasion in 1775 into Canada by Americans, and this force is coming down without much of a supply line, and it's surrounded and routed and at Saratoga, New York, and all of the arms are captured. And several of the generals associated with that suddenly start operating on their own. And so General Gates is in charge of that operation. And there's another general up there named General Putnam from Connecticut. And Putnam is entertaining the idea of just essentially a private invasion of New York City, to retake New York City from the British. And Gates is beginning his own connections with Congress, and Congress appoints him to the War Planning Board, which is essentially the body that Washington is supposed to answer to. It's sort of like the equivalent of the Defense Department. Washington's supposed to answer to this board that Gates is now on, but Gates is supposed to be his subordinate. And these guys are all egomaniacs, and things are beginning to spin out of control. And Hamilton, who's only 23 at this point, is sent on a mission to convince Putnam and Gates to come to heel and stick with the program, and to send some of the captured supplies down to Valley Forge, where the main body of the Continental Army is camped out for the winter. And he manages to do this and then falls into, and this is something that the literature on Hamilton and the war doesn't make much of. He then falls into what's described as a nervous fever. And it reads to me like a nervous breakdown. He's out of commission for 2 months. He's holed up at the house of some patriot civilian named Dennis Kennedy, I believe was the guy's name. And for 2 months is just out of commission, not with physical wounds, but with like a condition. And he then comes out of that. This is going into, this is like November 77 we're talking about, and end of December, early January, he comes out of this and goes back down to Valley Forge. And after that, his writing is really different. It's after this breakdown that this kind of boilerplate about freedom and democracy and individual rights, which he supports and all that, but that sort of fades in his work, and he gets much more into the economic problems of sovereignty, the question of like, what is the role of the state? How will this project actually work in the international context? And he begins laying out plans that will show up essentially as in parts of the Constitution, as the report on manufacturers. It lays this out in letters to powerful politicians, essentially saying like, we got to get real, okay? Like, and we have got to have a plan. We have got to be very specific and very realistic about what is required of this project.
And he even started writing while he was at Dennis Kennedy's house. So he's at Kennedy's house, starts these writings. So it's not even that it's just after the nervous breakdown. While he's going through this, he's coming to these conclusions. I found that to be very fascinating. That he would even have the time to do that as well.
In a way, being out of commission is one of the only ways he might. Though he remarkably would like work all day and then still write these kind of intellectual letters at night. I mean, how he did what he did was,
You describe him as a manic workaholic. And then the amount of writings, there's a portion, I don't think I wrote it out for a question, but in one of the chapters you mentioned that Washington and them had like a force of people who are just writing things and keeping them and holding on to them, like moving them from place to place. Like the amount of writing that was taking place was astronomical.
Yeah. Describe the army as like a giant letter writing machine.
That's something.
And everything had to be written and circulated, all the orders. And yeah, there was constant correspondence back and forth. And they were also, all of the American revolutionaries were very self-conscious of what they were doing historically. And they were quite concerned, partly out of their own, gigantic egos, but also partly out of a sense of the historical moment, that the records be, the papers of the army, the papers of Congress be preserved. This is the safety of the papers, meaning the archives, not just like immediate papers of concern, but the archives, that the archives of Congress be spirited away from the British.
Right. And just on an aside, this whole period is, it's kind of, it's crazy. Some of the stuff you describe, I'm reading through this and there's like people drinking, fighting, shootouts. Hamilton's good friend Lawrence and perhaps lover is like shot someone through the mouth with a musket. He himself is trying to go in and out of battle, sort of looking for glory and heroism and all of this. Like there's a portion you mentioned that he tried his. Let me read this real quick. So Lawrence, like Hamilton, I'm quoting, was recklessly brave, exhibiting what one biographer called an indirect self-destructive behavior. It was not his fault that he was not killed or wounded. It was like, this was like, so there's like, for me, it was interesting reading these portions, and I don't want to digress too much into this, but the sort of general craziness that was happening during this time, like people are dueling, like when we think of this history, I think people assume there's people in powdered wigs sort of sitting behind like these podiums having these discussions, which of course also happened, but there's like a whole nother side of this. It was just like a crazy social situation.
Yeah. The duels, those came from the challenge to Washington's authority that Hamilton puts an end to when he goes up to convince, it's just him. It's him and a one bodyguard assistant. And he's a 23-year-old kid, and he has to tell these major generals who just beat this huge British army and have like, one of the largest and best weapons caches in the world just fell into their possession. He has to convince them not to essentially turn into self-aggrandizing warlords, even though they have very powerful political supporters. So one of the things that comes out of that is what's called the Conway Cabal, that there's, long story short, that there are two duels fought, that this conflict isn't finally resolved until there are two duels fought, one in which John Lawrence is involved, and another one, I forget the details all, but yeah, one of them, an Irish officer, Conway, is shot through the mouth and like lives. Yeah. And I forget who it was who, it was Wayne. I think it was Anthony Wayne.
Like finally got him to shut up.
Yeah. He's the one who says the loud shut him up. But yeah. So yeah, that's the kind of thing that was going on.
I found that fascinating. Not that it's terribly surprising, but it towards the end of the chapter, of course, the theme that continues to come up throughout the book, Hamilton sees this necessity for some level of centralization. He sees through all of this chaos that this ends up with like the logic of Hamilton's developmentalism, and this is expressed in a letter to Duane that was fundamentally militarily. So you have a constitutionally strong and activist state could build a strong and wealthy economy, which in turn could fund a strong military, thus ensuring national survival and sovereignty. So this is really like this maturation process of Hamilton is really taking off sort of at the end of this period. So he connects, this is 1778, Hamilton joins Washington at Valley Forge, develops a more sophisticated political understanding, and then through his experiences on the battlefield, and this will come up again and again, but Hamilton comes to the conclusion that Congress should have more power, and at some level, centralization absolutely necessary for even battlefield operations. I found that as someone who's a veteran, some of these stories of just the chaotic nature of, acquisition of resources, materials, battle plans. I laughed earlier because I, when you said that these individual generals were going around soliciting their own materials from people they knew, I was trying to imagine what that would be like sort of as a lower rung enlisted person. So I was also conflicted in the chapter where you started talking about mutinies, because I was like, you see the necessity for the centralization and organization, the cohesiveness of the state, of your military units. But at the same time, of course, if you're one of those people, you can imagine how upset, how angry, frustrated you are. And we'll definitely.
For the rank and file, I mean, what that chaos meant was, hunger, disease, lack of food, lack of medicine. I mean, real poverty and real suffering.
Yeah.
Part of me researching this book, as a lefty, part of me, is like resisting the mythology of, America, blah, blah, blah. But then you read these accounts, it was like, these people really suffered a lot, agree or disagree with what they were doing, but they were really suffering.
Yeah, no, you forced me to think about that. I mean, I think we all probably fall into this. I mean, I'm probably willing to admit that about all kinds of things. But I mean, yeah, I think there's a part of what I like so much about this book and what you did was it made me drop some of that bullshit where I'm just like right away when it comes up, you're like, oh, founding fathers, slave owners, like this forced me to, I think, look at this in a more nuanced way, which I'm very thankful for. So chapter 3, the supply effort and grand forage to manufacturing. The military supply effort not only gave Hamilton a different view and education in economics, it also provided the groundwork for America's eventual industrialization. You call this a sort of war communism, though they didn't call it that, of course. A new political economy was forming. Explain what's happening during this period.
So the war is, an economic event, and Congress doesn't have the power to tax. The supply effort becomes very acute and very serious. And part of how the Continental Army supplies itself early on is that Congress starts printing money. Essentially two phases and you got to think of this at the ground. There's the kind of the supply effort, and then there's the sort of political economy of the states and Congress, and then this kind of collective entity, which is this emerging country, United States, represented by Congress, but also through these very autonomous states and its relationship to the rest of the world, namely creditors in Europe from whom they are borrowing money later on, and then also usually just generally turning right around and giving that money to weapons manufacturers in Europe to get weapons back to the U.S. So Congress starts printing this paper money, which very quickly loses value. So it's kind of like a process of confiscation by inflation. You're a farmer in New Jersey somewhere, and these guys, these rough-looking guys, come through, like a requisition squad from the Continental Army, and they're like, yo, we're here. We need, we need like one of your 2 horses. We're gonna need like, 8 of those 9 chickens, and here's money. And they've got guns and you don't. And you take the money because it's like, you can probably, if you move quickly enough, buy something with it. If you sit on it for too long, it'll lose value. But it was a process of printing money and then buying supplies with it. That it was a process of purchase that bordered on, just armed theft. So that was sort of the first stage, and the supply of continental dollars balloons because Congress just, keeps emitting these things, and then also the British get involved in counterfeiting. So there's just too much of this around, and it's not backed up with anything. And then after Saratoga, victory at Saratoga, going into the winter of 78, they managed to get a pretty big loan from the Dutch, and they're scraping up some other loans. And then the French start getting involved. And so there is a more ready supply of resources coming that way. And the continental dollars are so worthless that the Continental Army then shifts to essentially, without Congress, producing its own money, as it were. These essentially these IOUs, Pierce's notes, because the guy who signed them, it was like maybe the quartermaster general, I forget what his position was named Pierce. So, the soldiers in the field are getting what they need and paying people with these Pierce's notes. And at first, the Pierce's notes have this very restricted purpose. They're not supposed to be used as money, right? You're supposed to only use real money, like gold and silver coins, or British or French banknotes that somebody could theoretically take to some bank in another country and get gold for. But then immediately this essentially homemade money, second iteration of this continental money, these Pierce's notes, these IOUs are being used to extract resources from people, and these all of this debt from this war becomes important later in the story when the Constitution is finally ratified and the federal government is trying to create a national financial system. And the question of who will, how much of that debt should be honored, who will honor it, and who will owe it, it becomes very important. But that's for a later date.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little more about the inflation and war, the badness of money from Chapter 4. But in Chapter 3, you also mention that you have this sort of contradictory economic situation. So for some business, war is a stimulus. For other businesses, they're absolutely ravaged. Can you talk about some of these contradictions?
Yeah. At one level, the war is destructive. Things are being burnt down and blown up. But at another level, it's actually a stimulus to production, because you've got these three ravenous armies that are, they need enormous amounts of wood. They need enormous amounts of fodder for animals. They need salt, right? Salt is really important as a preservative. It's also crucial for the health of animals. If the horses and oxen that were pulling all of the supplies didn't have enough salt, they became very weak and useless, and salt was in very short supply, because previously salt had been brought over in the hulls of ships as ballast. So there wasn't much domestic manufacturing of salt in the U.S. It was imported, and it was instead of putting rocks in the bottom of your ship when you're bringing over some finished goods from Europe to the U.S., captains would put salt, because you could then sell that and then just put American rocks in the bottom of your ship for ballast going back. So when the war came along, there were no salt works, and there was a shortage of salt. So people had to start building salt works. There was a shortage. There was a shortage of iron and steel. And so they had to build these foundries. There had been foundries that had started earlier on, and they were suppressed by the British under the mercantilist controls on the industrialization of the periphery of the British Empire. So they had to build a nascent metal industry. The Continental Army set up two armories, one in Harper's Ferry and one in Springfield, Massachusetts, right? And these had to have supply chains of producing metal. That means you got to have coal mining, you've got to have iron mining, you've got to have the smelting and refining of all this stuff. So the war was also a tremendous stimulus to the economy. There was a lot of economic activity. There was a lot of investment. If you were a person in, say, the Connecticut River Valley who had the money to invest in, some sort of foundry, chances are during the war you would make a lot of money supplying the armory at Springfield. So there are these contradictory macroeconomic dynamics. On the one hand, the productive capacity of the U.S. or the nascent U.S. is being destroyed. For example, before the war, one of the forms of manufacturing that was permitted was shipbuilding, because wood was so cheap and plentiful here. And so the way that ships were exported was that American colonists would build ships with American wood and then load them up with American cargoes and sell these cargoes often in the Mediterranean, and then bring the ships up to the UK and then sell the ship and then head home with their money. The investor, would head home with their money and do it all over again. But all of these shipyards are attacked and burned because they're vulnerable. They're on the coast. The docks, the kind of the infrastructure of peacetime is destroyed. There had been a lot of fishing, and that is largely shut down. The fishing fleet is damaged. So these contradictory dynamics economically. Smuggling arises. New England had been, a huge shipping power, as it were, and fishing power. But on the one hand, that's shut down. On the other hand, privateering takes off, and smuggling in and out of the Caribbean. So the Caribbean becomes a kind of a free trade zone of sorts. The island of Eustasia, I think is how you pronounce it, where there's a lot of a kind of like a huge black market in, supplies. American ships go down with whatever they have, export goods and or money, and come back with tents and weapons and stuff like that.
And this part I thought was phenomenal. I had no idea. So you write that the Continental Army's peak strength was only 22,000 at any given time, with only 100,000 to 200,000 Americans, maybe 10% living in the colonies, even serving in the war. I don't know why I would thought that number was higher. Were you surprised by that, or did you think it would be lower than that when you came across that? Because I don't know. I know you pulled that from someone.
I think I was a bit surprised by that as well. I think I thought it was going to be higher because of the the image of the Minutemen,
right?
And that that the Continental Army were a bunch of small farmers who all volunteered and fought this this overlord. And there was an element of that. I mean, certainly that describes the Minutemen. There was a fairly egalitarian distribution of wealth in New England, around Concord at that time. But there was also, I mean, that's not the entire society, right? So actually the bulk of the soldiers were young, poor, penniless immigrants, and and native born, but a lot of them were immigrants. And sounds familiar, right? It's like the U.S. Army has often been like this.
Yep.
And it wasn't farmers who had 40 acres and whatever. I mean, they were also in the military, but they were not the only ones. And there were also wealthy interests that didn't want to go to war, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, and it turns out that it's rare that I don't think I put this stat in the book, but I think the highest percentage of the male population that has fought in wars, like at any one time, is like 16%. It still strikes me as strangely low. Like how could that be for the Civil War? I mean, I'm not sure that applies to certain parts of the South, but yeah, I mean, you got all the young people and then all the old people. You think about, especially now, we have a different view of age in the modern era, but 35, 40-year-old farmer is like pretty broken down. Sailor, you've gone to sea a bunch of times. You make it to age 35. I mean, you're pretty beat up by that point.
Yeah.
So the rank and file of the Continental Army were these young dudes,
And gun ownership was limited, you mentioned as well. They come from the proletariat. You mentioned, of course, propertyless, poor, gun ownership, very limited. And then you mentioned that public spending increases drastically during this period. Gunpowder becomes particularly important throughout this period. There was also this lack of interstate coordination, which we talked about. But once again, Hamilton sees the need for centralization and planning. Talk to us a little bit about this. And of course, at the same time, you mentioned salt is essential. We have raids taking place, people essentially going from area to area, stealing goods and whatever they could find that they needed. Many people turning to smuggling and privateering. And then, of course, New England shipping interests sort of did the best out of all of this. But this is a really wild period. I mean, there's literally people running around burning down like shipping yards and ships all over the place. This, this seemed, it's not, surprising, of course, that once again Hamilton comes to this conclusion that there's an absolute need for centralization and planning. And then this sort of gets to the sort of creation of the Board of War and the fact that it doesn't really have much power. Can you talk about this to sort of round out chapter 3?
Yeah, I mean, it is out of this chaotic struggle that Hamilton becomes convinced that that Congress not only needs the power to tax, but it needs that the Articles of Confederation need to be scrapped, and there needs to be a whole new constitution with an actually functioning central government, not a notional central government. And in terms of the supplies, paper's another thing, and it's it's in this. What part of what is also important about this is that there was a successful effort to ramp up domestic production during this war. A lot of stuff that the U.S. used during the war was imported, particularly some of the better weapons. For example, the cannons that came from Europe were much better than the ones made in the U.S. The Europeans would pour the cannon as the barrel of the cannon as a solid piece of metal, and then bore out the center. And the Americans would try and save all that labor of laboriously boring out the bore of the cannon by building them hollow, but that made them weaker, made them spongy. So certain things had to be bought with hard currency that was borrowed from Europe and purchased in Europe. But a lot of stuff, gunpowder, salt, paper, metal, muskets, shoes, hats, a lot of this stuff was successfully produced in the colonies. And it was through this process that Hamilton began to realize the importance of manufacturing, that this is the source of wealth, in an abstract sense of sort of value added, but also that if a country cannot produce the things it needs to defend itself, then its sovereignty is not going to be defendable. You cannot, even if you can afford to purchase what you need from abroad, there's an implicit weakness in that. And that was very much, after the war, that's the Southern position, the elite Southern position, because they're doing fine exporting these highly profitable crops to Europe and then importing wonderful finished goods, often much better than could be produced in the U.S., to themselves. Jefferson was kind of a shopaholic, where he had French couches, French wine. So the Southern elite who controlled the political process, they were fine not industrializing and just having this kind of export-oriented economy. And Hamilton, among other lessons, realized that was a real kind of political military vulnerability. And also he saw that there really was this tremendous capacity, kind of latent industrial capacity in the colonies. And Tench Cox, who becomes his collaborator and assistant at the Treasury Department, is similarly involved in this kind of wartime production. And so they take certain lessons from the wartime production into the post-war process of industrialization.
Let's take us into chapter 4, the badness of money, inflation, and war. I want to read a quote that you actually quote here, and then we'll get into this situation with money, which I found fascinating. So just this alone. So this is the beginning of chapter 4. In colonial America, money was a chaotic thing. As one historian described it, quote, in 1774, each of the provinces in North America had its own paper currency, which not only varied in value from province to province, but varied in relation to the coins of England, Spain, Portugal, France, and the Netherlands, all of which circulated throughout America. In addition, sub-provinces had 2 sets of currency, one differing in value from the other. Newspapers and almanacs published lists of the comparative value of the several monies from time to time for the use of merchants and farmers, unquote. I mean, that sounds totally I mean, crazy. I ran into Sergio's room actually the other day and read him that paragraph. I was like, he was shaking his head like he already knew, but I thought that was fascinating. Talk to us about the trouble that this posed, and then how this again leads Hamilton to think about planning, centralization, the power of Congress, the power of the state to sort of regulate this process. And then he also comes to the conclusion that debt isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as you can pay it off. Can you talk about this?
Yeah. So, I mean, I kind of touched on it earlier, but out of sequence, I guess. Yeah. So there is step one in funding the war is this printing of money. You've got Congress's printing money, and you've got the states printing money. And that will lead to kind of hyperinflation. So it's a kind of, confiscation by inflation. And Congress emits $200 million in continental dollars, which, is an enormous amount of money. And that they cover three-quarters of their spending with this just printed money that people were forced to take. The kind of calamity that flows from this chaotic money situation. And I mean, the money is not the fundamental problem with the money, the paper money that is emitted, is that it's not backed up by very much, right? It's not backed up by an organized state, and it's not backed up by a banking system. And now this is the classic kind of point that everybody takes from Hamilton. I mean, the Hamilton that you're going to get to know in any other book on Hamilton is Hamilton the banker, essentially. And that's important, but what I was trying to do here is add like Hamilton the state-oriented industrial planner who did not respect markets, but like thought markets were something that had to be achieved. But anyway, so the fact that this money isn't backed up with anything, I mean, among the things that it's not backed up by is a functioning tax system, right? So the devaluation of money, the proliferation of money, and the failure of Congress to tax, what Hamilton is seeing amidst the inflation of the war are all of the negative effects of the lack of a credit system. And what he will then very much achieve and argue for is a credit system that is founded on a central bank that is autonomous from, but ultimately controlled by the government, right? It's autonomous from the political process, but it is significant, 20% owned by the new federal government. We're getting ahead of ourselves. But that's what comes out of this experience of just this like endless inflation and chaos, where you go through the continental dollars, then into the certificates, the Pierce notes.
I mean, so chaotic that you have the Continental Army foraging within the colonies.
Yeah. And people resisting, right? There's these accounts of, and raiding back. I mean, the Continental Army is confiscating stuff and then supplies. One letter I quote is some Pennsylvania politician answering Washington. He's like shaking them down for more. A lot of what Washington did, and therefore Hamilton on his staff, was basically beg politicians, right? Polite but firm letters being like, we need more stuff. We need money, like hard money or state paper money that you're going to like invent out of nothing, or supplies, like you got to help us. And in one of these exchanges, one of these politicians is like, well, we just sent a bunch of cloth. And the answer that comes back is like, well, yeah, no, actually, somewhere along the way, like a bunch of hungry, ill-clothed people looted that and took it. So it's gone. Sorry.
Yeah.
It
sounds very much like developing states today that we would, or, what people would call the global South, et cetera. And this gets to your point about, none of this being inevitable, the development of the state. But it reminds me, I mean, throughout these periods, I'm thinking of, stories I'm reading from developing economies around the world today that are dealing with very similar issues. You also mentioned, so we talked a little bit about his ideas of money, banking, economic underdevelopment combined with the war's colossal expenses. This eventually destroys production and procurement of needed goods. But then Hamilton sees this need for foreign loans and again sort of proves his political chops by finding this way, which I found very interesting. I mean, these are the insights from the book, I think, as any political activist or organizer, even politicians, can sort of take away some of these lessons, especially if you don't have the power to do one of the other. In other words, he found a way to sort of harness and bind these interests to the state. So you have profiteers, you have speculators out there who are driving down the value of these currencies. People see this as a problem. Some people are saying, look, why doesn't the state take total control? Other people are saying, why don't you let these private entities run wild? Hamilton tries to find a way to sort of bind these entities to the state, which today seems like a very important lesson, because it doesn't seem clear to me two things. One, that the left, particularly, let's say in the United States, but in most parts of the world, doesn't have the power, vision, or organizational capacity to take over everything on its own, say if it were to take the state apparatus. But even in the United States today, there's not a movement big enough to say overthrow capital, but there might be movements big enough or strong enough to bind capital to some kind of national interest here in the United States, maybe even international interests. We'll eventually talk about climate change and so forth. But can you talk a little bit about this? This again shows that like how smart Hamilton is, but I think there's real lessons for today. And each of these, we can see this, but I think particularly here was one of the moments in the book where I stopped and said, okay, this is something that we can apply in real time.
Okay, I will speak to that both in the specifics and the general kind of problem you lay out in your question that goes beyond this. So, so specifically, Hamilton starts getting into the question of a bank when the question of how do they manage this large European loan that they get. And as you laid out in your question, it's like, what should the role of the state be? Should they just hand it off to privateers? And Hamilton becomes aware of essentially the problem of the rich, right? The problem of the national, to put it in Marxist terms, it's like the problem of the national bourgeoisie. This is something that people used to talk about during the Cold War. It was a big question in Central America, for the Sandinistas and for the FMLN. It's like, what is the role for the national capitalist class, and does the revolutionary movement have the capacity to run a modern economy without some of the expertise and actual capital that these people have? And I think there's ultimately no satisfying answer to that question. Because one answer is, I'll get back to Hamilton after this digression into the Cold War. One answer is you get rid of these people because they're always going to sell out the revolution, that every developmentalist project is always betrayed by them, that the national bourgeoisie is okay with a developmentalist state while it's protecting them, while it's helping them gain market share, while it's subsidizing R&D, and making them great. And then as soon as they're big enough to throw their weight around on the international stage and they start feeling constrained by the state, they push back, right? This would be the story of the capitalist class in South Korea, right? It was for a while very much under the control of the state, but eventually the state developmentalist project is so successful that this class doesn't just need the Korean market, doesn't just need Korean banks. And so they push for a neoliberal agenda of deregulation, and they push off the very set of rules, and they destroy the very tools that had brought them to power. The other solution is, well, because those folks are always going to betray you, you just get rid of them, right? You just confiscate their wealth, you drive them out of the country, or you jail them and re-educate them, or you shoot them, or whatever it is. But then that has major problems, because expertise is really serious, and in developing economies, it's highly dangerous to say, well, elites, we don't want elites. We're just with the peasants and the workers. It's like, well, who are the elites? Just the top bankers. But what about their son-in-law, who's also like a major engineer in the oil refinery? You got to be careful alienating these elites, because you might find yourself without any electricity.
Right.
And what has happened is that I mean, the Latin American left continually has dealt with this problem, and I mean, there is no, I don't think there is a clear answer. In Venezuela, part of what's going on, the main thing that's going on in Venezuela is U.S. sanctions, right? But there's also the fact that a certain kind of technical capacity has been drained out of the country because the professional class has been alienated. The Venezuelan revolution didn't like line them up, whack them for their political beliefs and take their property, right? They tried to sort of keep them there as part of the project. So but they had been sufficiently alienated from the project that you now have really major problems at a technical level, right? So Hamilton, before all of this, was dealing with this kind of question. And what he concluded was that you had to essentially keep your enemies close. That if you had a purely, he's not in this moment in the war creating a bank, but he's starting to plan the role of the central bank. And he's really starting to, increasingly, he's laying out the template for what we now call a fiscal military state, a strong central state that can tax, that has a bank and can, fund its operations through taxation and borrowing. And it can borrow. And the crucial role of borrowing in all this is linked to war. And this is one of the points from Adam Smith that Hamilton takes. Smith says that a state always needs the capacity to borrow because during an emergency, particularly war, it will need lots of money quickly. And so a state must have good credit, essentially, if it is to issue lots of debt and have that debt purchased, then it needs to have good credit. And in times of peace and calm, it can run on its tax take alone. But when there's a calamity, you got to throw money at the problem, right? This is sort of what's happening here with COVID. We got to just throw money at the problem. And you see a similar thing that's happening with the Trump administration that happened with the Bush administration, where you've got these ardent free marketeers throwing their ideology out the window and just being like, we got to throw money at the problem. We've got basically Jerome Powell and Steve Mnuchin are now to the left of Andrew Cuomo. They're like, the message from the Federal Reserve is like, the Federal Reserve will buy all debt that states issue. Not all debt, it's like 20% of their budgets, which is the general projected shortfall. And Andrew Cuomo in New York is, pursuing austerity at the same time that these right-wing economists are saying, no, what you need to do fiscal stimulus. The state needs to spend money. Don't cut the teachers' salaries. Don't fire the adjuncts. Pay them. You don't have the money because the tax base has contracted because the economy is contracted. Issue a bond. You're worried that Wall Street won't buy it because they're in crisis and freaking out. It doesn't matter. The Federal Reserve will buy your bond. States can issue this debt. It will be purchased by the federal government. And it's these, Democratic governors frequently who are like not doing that and pursuing austerity. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. But
no, it's okay. It's okay because eventually Hamilton returns to the battlefield for the final assault on Yorktown.
But my point.
Go ahead. Go ahead, though.
Hamilton. So the thing about the kind of mixed public-private ownership of the federal the first bank of the United States is fundamentally about, in my view, Hamilton's realization that you had to keep this predatory speculative class involved enough in the state's project to want that state project to succeed and to not want to destroy it and undermine it. And that if you totally excluded them, they would attack and try and parasitically just suck what they could out of it. If you handed the whole thing over to them, they would completely mismanage it and just like take the money and not do the right things with it. So there had to be a balance of harnessing their self-interest and avarice to this larger project. And that's what he attempts to do. And then he realizes that, in the context of this struggle to manage the loan and supply the army through the end of the war.
Which he eventually re-enters the battlefield at Yorktown. This brings an end to military operations. We have the Treaty of Paris, 1783. This brings us to Chapter 5, Military Mutiny in the Critical Period. So by the end of the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army was basically in shambles. You had internal struggles, but not all of them class struggles, though many of them featured class antagonisms. There's still these antagonisms were sort of multi-layered. So talk about some of these conflicts during the critical period. You had Southern slave owners becoming increasingly concerned, and then we can go into sort of the mutinies, which were throughout the American army, and then this led to a crisis point in 1781.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this chapter was, to some extent, a rethinking for me of what I had, a kind of interpretation of American history that had class at the center. And that is my framework. I have class at the center. But what I came to realize was that there was a lot of the instability at the end, towards the end of the war and after the war, was not reducible to class struggle. That's actually kind of a simplification of it. So the critical period refers to the period between the the Treaty of Paris, as you mentioned, and the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and then ratification in 89. And what happens is it begins during the war, because the Brits are pushed out of the North, and then the war shifts to the South. And so by 1780-81, fighting is pretty minimal in the North, and it picks up in the South. And the economy begins to constrict radically, because there isn't this kind of stimulus effect that we described earlier from the war, and all you have are the negative sides of the war, which is just destruction and the battering of the means of production. The critical period is the moment when the political arrangements embodied in I'm having a senior moment here. Anyway, in the Articles of Confederation are becoming increasingly problematic, because states are, at least during the war, they are sort of bound together like a threatened flock of sheep, kind of all coming together. But once the threat of military occupation and foreign aggression is gone, each state government starts flexing its muscles and pursuing again with more vigor their individual projects. So you have, for example, the great port of New York and the government in New York essentially starting little mini trade wars with New Jersey and Connecticut. And this is, very bad for the macroeconomic situation, but it's, good for the very immediate short-term interests of specific New York interests, private interests, and political interests. And so it becomes clear during the critical period that this whole thing might fall apart. Some of the other problems that are emerging during the critical period, some of the problems in the critical period are just very clearly class struggles. And the culminating struggle of that is Shays Rebellion. But there are other struggles that are like, cross-class alliances. So in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, there is, I think I'm jumping ahead am I jumping ahead to the next chapter, chapter 6? I'm trying to.
It's okay. It's okay. What I was hoping you could take us to is sort of these. So we have this lack of coordination in terms of supply coordination and fiscal policy. All of this sort of due to decentralization. I'm just going off of my notes now. This leads to the mutinies. So these mutinies are occurring like throughout. The Southern slave owners are concerned. You have mutinies because of this lack of like.
Okay, so the crisis of the. I put this book to bed a couple months ago, and then I was just like, I don't want to think about like the 18th century or economic history, and I just started obsessively reading about the history of the CIA and acid for the last like 3 months. So I haven't actually looked at
Was that the book that this guy was just interviewed on Joe Rogan's podcast? I saw this guy who wrote a book. It was something about the CIA and LSD. I'm assuming it's that. What's the name of the book that?
Was it Stephen Kinzer, Poisoner in Chief? That's a great book about Stephen Gottlieb, who was the head of like their head chemist, the CIA's head chemist, and who was did horrible things, including experiment with LSD. That's a great story. You should interview somebody about that.
I will.
Hey, I'd rant. I'd chew your ear for an hour about that. Not that I've ever written anything about the CIA and LSD, but I just did read I think it was about 10 books about all that stuff.
Jesus.
But anyway, I'm merely making excuses for why I'm not on top of my own book.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I know how it goes.
After you've been slaving away at a book like this, you're just going to turn your back on it for a while. So I'm like, yes. So chapter 5, the mutiny. So the critical period essentially begins while the war is winding down, and it begins with these mutinies. Mm-hmm. And they are primarily in New Jersey and the mid-Atlantic areas. And these soldiers some of the issues that these soldiers are dealing with are that they are recruited with promises of pay in money that was worth more when they were going to get paid by it with it, so they've literally sometimes been fighting for, several years without any pay whatsoever, and their families are hungry. They don't have supplies. The Continental Army is a class-ridden thing. Discipline is very extreme. But the main thing is, once the fighting is winding down, a lot of these soldiers, they want out. And the terms of some of their conditions were that they would fight for 1 year or till the end of the war. I think that's what it was, 1 year. And so there are a series of these mutinies. And
they're successful. So you have this word spreading throughout. I mean, one of the portions I found fascinating as well was you write, unable to confront the mutiny, army brass and politicians had to negotiate. The mutineers won. It was agreed that the men were, in fact, at the end of their contracts and would thus be discharged. So you had varying successes, but again, this shows, for Hamilton at least, this shows this lack of state power, this authority and coordination that both the army needs coming from Congress. Certain times the people who mutinied were successful. Eventually, Washington orders this crushing of a mutiny. The mutinies continue. There's this lack of supply coordination and so on. But then again, sort of Hamilton, he leaves the army in 1782 and is appointed to Congress, where he's then sort of able to take on this issue.
Yeah. The mutinies, they are, as you say, first successful. They're marching toward 6% of all court-martials involve mutinies. And the mutinies begin very early in the war, but then they pick up towards the end. And frequently these guys want to get paid, and they're in one of these mutinies, they're marching towards Philadelphia. They surround the Philadelphia legislature. There's a shootout with the city cavalry, kind of elite cavalry guard made up of upper middle class guys who own horses, against these, ragtag, battle-hardened infantry guys. And the mutinies are kind of placated at first. There's this shootout. States are leaned on to come up with money. States are resisting. Central Army saying, you got to pay these guys. And then, this is not putting an end to it. And then Washington starts getting harsh with them. And in one mutiny, orders, picks out, I think it's 12 of the chief mutineers and makes another 12 of the leaders shoot their comrades. So they come down with an iron fist on this stuff. And then the culmination of this is when the officers who are camped at Newburgh, New York, are getting restless. They're stuck up there, and they don't know what's going on. The economy is collapsing around them. They're getting letters from their families about how desperate the situation is. And the literature on Newburgh is typically that these guys were a bunch of dangerous aristocrats who were attempting a coup d'etat. One thing I noticed in writing this book is like there's a lot of there was a lot of invective in the writing of American history that is not backed up. People do not often prove their points. They repeat each other's interpretations as if those are facts. They cite somebody who makes this or that claim and start digging into people's footnotes. Like, where's the proof of this stuff? So I took a more sympathetic view of as it's called, the Newburgh conspiracy. This is in many ways like the culminating mutiny. And these officers, yes, they are elite, especially compared to the foot soldiers, but they were not the elites who stayed at home, getting rich off the supply effort, right? These were the guys who were out in the field, actually often spending their own money to supply their troops. They were from elite classes, but they weren't all from elite classes. Daniel Shay, who leads Shays Rebellion in Western Mass, where I live, in the midst of Shays Rebellion country right now. He's a farmer. He's like a middle class farmer, and by the end of the critical period, he's impoverished and he's in rebellion because he's so indebted. So I take a somewhat sympathetic view to the Newburgh conspiracy, which is going to scandalize a certain type of American historian, and a certain type of morally righteous lefty who might like to jump to conclusions. So what
I get the sense you like to do that shit.
Yeah, I don't know if I like it, but I feel it just happens. So they want to be paid and they want to be released, and they threaten to march off. They don't threaten a coup d'etat, but they basically threaten to abandon the whole project. Mm-hmm. And this conspiracy is found out. Washington confronts them and says, "Look, what you mean? You're gonna throw this entire project away if you do this." And they simmer down. At this point, Hamilton is out of the army and he is in government in New York. And and these mutinies go on until the war is over and the army is disbanded. And it gets pretty dicey. I mean, it's another one of those moments where this whole project, which we were all brought up in grade school and high school and even college to, maybe not explicitly being told this, but implicitly the message is that this was sort of inevitable. We're a great nation. We're a great people. This was there's even quality books rehearse this kind of horse shit. I was just reading an economic history of the U.S. that's by some basically kind of center-right guys. Very interesting stuff in it, but it begins with this kind of like fantastical horse shit about the American character and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, what's implicit in that is that this was all like, inevitable and great. And it wasn't inevitable at all. And in that, just to make some of the subtext for a left audience, make some of this explicit, is like, this is the kind of thing that social change involves. Nothing is inevitable, right? There are always these very difficult political choices. There's this very difficult process and set of problems around organizing and compromising and of getting types of power and wielding that power responsibly and in a constructive way. And there's far too much, there are far too many elements on the US left who have an aversion to power and domination, right? This is something my wife, Marcy Smith, has written about in 2 fantastic essays on Non-Psych about Gene Sharp and his influence on the US left. So that's some of the subtext in my reading of this history. But anyway, that's the story of the mutinies. And the mutinies then give way to the post-war depression and the other political conflicts of the critical period.
And we'll jump straight into that because I don't want to take, I know we're probably already going over time, but here I do want to mention by the time Hamilton gets to Congress in 1782, begins his term as a delegate from New York. At this point, you mentioned that Congress still lacked the power to tax. So you have this again, this chaotic nature of acquiring funding at the time, officers individually lobbying state governments for funds and supplies. We talked a little bit about the class, sort of complex class relations within the Continental Army, not so clear cut in terms of the officers in Newburgh, and even the relationship they had to the war itself. I mean, much different than even, say, Sergio and I's experience in Iraq, where we would have officers who would maybe go outside the wire like maybe once or twice a month or something like this. And, you know, these guys were like there maybe drinking better wine and so forth, but still dying, like living in the shit. Yeah. And then eventually a committee petitions Congress. Can you talk about how bad the situation was that they sort of threatened to defect to the Northwest territories, but then Washington intervened, sort of saves the day for the time being? At least that's the way it's portrayed. Can you talk about this period as well, and then we'll jump into the post-war depression once the...
Yeah, that's the Newburgh conspiracy. I mean, that is, these officers, they issue a letter to Congress basically saying, we got to get paid. And if we're not paid, there's going to be problems. And specifically, the problems are going, were that they would march off into essentially what is now Ohio, and thereby leave the country open to reinvasion. And I mean that's dealt with by Washington, and much is made of this. I resisted. There's a kind of lionization of Washington in this moment, and I trace the sources back, and it goes back to John Fiske's book. He's the guy who was a historian in the 1880s, who wrote a book. He coined the term the critical period, and he's the source for this story. And I was, for a while, convinced that I could prove that this was all bullshit because it was so sentimental. And that there's a play right around the time that John Fiske writes this book that portrays this event. And I was like, oh, I'll bet that's what it is. But ultimately, it does seem that the vignette is based on some truth. And so what happens is that there is this gathering conspiracy in Newburgh to, they're threatening Congress and they're threatening march away, and they call a second meeting. They have this anonymous letters. And Washington is tipped off to this, and he calls a meeting before their meeting and gathers them all there and confronts them, and is apparently, this is why I resisted this. I was convinced this was from a play, but he was given a pair of glasses by a guy who had started making glasses, and it's one of the first people to make glasses in what would be the U.S. And he's confronting them, and he's going to read. He has spent 2 days writing this solemn rebuke, and he moving from the extemporaneous to his reading, he pulls out his glasses and he says, "Excuse me, I've not only grown old in fighting with you, but I seem to have grown blind." And part of his argument is I was here with you, man. We've been fighting. We've been doing this whole thing together. You're gonna abandon it now. And the story is that they're just these guys are kind of mortified that they could do this, and that Washington convinced them to pack it in. And part of what there's various theories of what was going on. Some people like to say that this was really about Gates and Putnam, who had this conflict going back to the showdown after Saratoga, where Hamilton confronts them and then collapses into his nervous breakdown. That these tensions, and that those tensions which erupt into the Conway cabal and these two duels, that this is still part of what's going on there. And I don't think there's clear proof that this was all ginned up by Gates and Putnam, but these officers had very real concerns, right? Mm-hmm. They were going broke. And yes, they were from the class. Their brothers and cousins were rich, whatever, a lot of them. But they were trapped there in this cantonment going broke. And their wives and children were writing and being like, what do we do now? How do we pay for the upkeep? What are we going to do? So Washington saves the day with this kind of like, I'm not a Washington fan at all. Washington sounds like, he was like a slave owner. He was the richest guy in America. He violated the law later, and this wasn't in the book, but one of his slaves escaped to Pennsylvania, and there's a letter where he instructs a guy to go essentially kidnap this escaped slave back, this escaped person back into slavery. So I'm not trying to venerate Washington, but there's this dramatic moment where, Washington, uses his leadership abilities to undo this whole thing.
And this takes us to the post-war depression, chapter 6, and we have here Hamilton gets married, gets back to upstate New York, gets married, passes the bar exam, but the post-depression starts to really sink in. You have economic contractions, debts, and so on. Talk to us about Hamilton's immediate observations concerning post-war America in this catastrophic period of the 1780s. You sort of talk about this as like a period that was paying for the war without people knowing that they were paying for the war. And you also mentioned that this period rivals, if not surpasses, the sort of economic depravity of the Great Depression. That's quite something.
Yeah. There weren't the same kind of economic statistics kept, and a lot of the records have been destroyed. But part of what economic historians do is they try to, produce data sets that you could measure macroeconomic patterns with retroactively. And over time, more and more records are digitized and written about. And so, in recent years, economic historians, only in 2012 that some economic historians felt that they could sort of do a macroeconomic analysis of, given all the sources of the post-war depression. And they determined that the contraction in GDP, right, economic activity, was equivalent to or worse than the Great Depression. So this is a serious economic crisis. Inflation was the problem during the war. Now deflation becomes the problem. Prices start dropping. At one level, that sounds great, right? If all prices went down. But the problem with that is when there's hardcore deflation, investors stop investing. If you know that you can make money by simply sitting on the money you have, why risk it by rebuilding some shipyard or rebuilding some docks or, whatever, right? Just sit on the money you have, because whatever you can buy with it today, you're going to be able to buy more with that same amount of money in a month or 2 months or 3 months. And then once investment is withdrawn because investors are just hoarding, then that just makes the economic contraction worse. So that's the danger with deflation. So there's a deflationary spiral is setting in. And, it's a very, very serious crisis. And so, some of the, this 2012 study saw like a 20% per capita decline in income. Mm-hmm. And, all of the wartime industries just start folding. All of these, foundries and iron mills, they all fold. There's also no central government yet. So there's no clear trade policy. So there's then this like massive wave of imports. And that also damages the nascent industrial sectors that had, industrial is probably too grand a word, the manufacturing capacity that had built up during the war. The American manufacturing has, higher costs and can't compete with these imports. So then that further damages the economic capacity. More businesses go out, go under, and more people are left unemployed. And I mean, it's a very, very serious
the same
dilemma.
for food imports.
Yes.
So not just these goods, but also you have this problem with food imports, and then eventually we have becomes really the first, well, what will become the U.S., but the first Treasury Secretary. I mean, Hamilton ends up again in this position where he becomes the Treasury Secretary in 1789. Does this full calculation, as you write, quote, of America's total foreign debt. The sum owed in various currencies was equal to $11.7 million. Hamilton also estimated the total debt, which came out to $79 million. Servicing these post-war debts required extremely high state and national taxes.
Right. So this is actually, I mean, a lot of that is happening before he's Treasury Secretary, because that doesn't happen until after the Constitution. So you've got the decline of demand that was the war, you've got the flood of imports, and then you've also got these debts. The states own lots of debts, Congress has debts, and so to pay off these debts, the states are imposing very, very serious and onerous taxes on the economy, which further constricts consumption, i.e. demand, which, is then going to hurt production. And so there's this terrible downward spiral and lots, increasing like misery. There's so much to say about this, but I mean,
in Massachusetts, you have taxation on farmers was estimated at 4 to 5 times higher in 1786 than it had been under all of British rule.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So you have these people sitting there going, wait a minute, we've been through this, and now this is the result of this supposed revolution. I mean, you can imagine the kind of anger that would cause.
Yeah, and the other thing that is like adding salt to this wound is that a lot of these debts are, in the form of these certificates, these IOUs that were issued by the states and by Congress, but mostly by the state, or a lot of them by the states during the war. And so these suppliers, these contractors and soldiers who've been paid in these things are, amidst this crisis, totally desperate, and so they're selling these IOUs for a fraction of their face value. And who buys them up? But of course, the people with money, the elites, and they are the ones who are, leaning on state governments to increase taxes so that the IOUs that these speculators have purchased for a song can be paid. So that's, there's a kind of a class struggle going on through this whole question of paying off these debts, because these debts are, some of them are foreign, but some of them are also internal. And it's the speculative class is really, starting to pull away and having, its own very horrible interests that are destroying the economic prospects of the country. And then there's a really crucial component in this. There's the tax requisition of 1785 is this one really, really big tax requisition. And this is what's going to lead to Shays Rebellion, because it's all through 1786 that this money is being collected by these states. So Congress in 1785 asks the states to come up with $3 million. And they want half of this paid in hard currency, not state issued funny money. And the states are trying to extract this from the people. And this is what helps trigger Shays Rebellion. And it's interesting.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Amidst this, Hamilton is, he's in private practice, but it's amidst all this that he goes into government in New York. So he gets back, he goes, sort of enters the second part of his career. He's like, starts out as really as a pamphleteer and a journalist, and then as a soldier. And then there's this interregnum of a lawyer, getting married, having kids, trying to make some money. And then going into the New York State government, and that kind of launches the second half of his life and career as a politician. Not really not a politician, because he didn't run for political office, but as a political operative, as a state-making bureaucrat.
And at this point, just around 1785, you have Hamilton comes to this conclusion that, building on his on his previous conclusions, that America must change its economy to save the nation. So he was genuinely concerned at this moment that these sort of deteriorating economic conditions could very well cause a civil war.
And we should plunge. What about Chapter 7? What the political? Because the story of this post-war depression. How far are we going in this one? What was?
We're just going up to Chapter 8, so we'll finish. Actually, we could just finish Chapter 6 right there. And yeah, Chapter 7 I also found. I mean, the whole thing fascinating, but this particular chapter, the amount of sort of interstate struggles and these like multi-layered clashes between different class factions, cross-class alliances, as you put it. Talk to us a little bit about the Wild Yankees, their clashes with the Pennamites. We've got the Maroons during this period. We have Native American violence. And of course, this brings us up to Chapter 8 in Shays Rebellion.
Yeah. So the post-war depression is the kind of the basis for all this, but the political fallout of that economic crisis is increasing conflict between states, within states, increasing class conflict. And so in the Wyoming Valley, I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, there are these competing bands of settlers who are backed by these different land speculators. And this breaks out into open conflict in this period. You've got Yankees from New England and Pennamites from Pennsylvania, and there's a little bit of a cultural difference between them, sort of British Yankees, English originated Yankees, and then a little bit more kind of like German and Scotch Irish element in the Pennamites. But the main thing is just they have these conflicting land claims, and they start burning each other's houses and killing each other and having firefights. And each is backed, and these are like, poor and middle class settlers fighting it out, backed by these big speculative land companies. So it's an example of the kind of cross-class alliances that are producing some of this conflict. There's also, Shays Rebellion is the epitome of it. There's a lot of just stark class conflict. In Rhode Island, one of the things that's going on, one of the ways that some states try to deal with their debts is to inflate them away. And so in Rhode Island, they're trying to just sort of like inflate away their debt. And a progressive coalition essentially has taken charge of the state government, and you have merchants and speculators who own these debts trying to flee the state because their creditors are coming to them being like, hey, I've got the money to pay you, and they don't want to get paid because it's worthless Rhode Island script. And the government in Rhode Island says, no, all debts can be paid, and you do not have the right to turn down payment of a debt in this script that we're producing. So that's an example of kind of class conflicts that are going on. You've got a similar, in terms of this kind of the Yankee-Pennamite war in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania that gets, pretty bloody. Ethan Allen is drawn down from Vermont to sort of help out. You've got violence in Vermont that's been going on since the 1760s, and sort of gets bound up in the war, where there are people who have received their land grants from the New Hampshire colonial government versus people who have received their land grants from the New York colonial government. And the people who tended to receive their grants from New Hampshire were sort of a more middling type, but not necessarily. Ethan Allen was also like a big, land speculator, a bit of a thug. But they, they're resisting these sort of large and wealthy New York landowners who are claiming Vermont. This is getting violent. Down in what's now eastern Tennessee, there is a similar conflict going on. This is that area, which is now, it's where Dolly Parton is from, actually, Sevier County, Tennessee. I was down there a couple years ago. And it's where Dollywood is as well, which is, the landscape is beautiful. Dollywood is a little weird, but, and all the kind of like bluegrass, kind of Disney-esque kitschy tourism, but it's an interesting area. Anyway, so that's all part of North Carolina at this time. And the settlers out there want to break away from North Carolina because they want to, they want to write their own rules. And one of the things they want to do is they want to go after Indians. This is a constant theme in American history. One of the reasons that white settlers on the frontier resist central authority is because they want to go steal land from Indians and kill Indians. And the central authority is for various reasons. Frequently, they just want to keep the peace. They don't want to provoke a larger war. Usually not out of some humanitarian sensibility, but sometimes they also are just like, wait a minute, like enough of this killing. So there's that similar dynamic is going on. These settlers out in what's now Sevier County, Tennessee, they want to go to war against the Cherokee, right? They want to like claim all this land, and the elites, particularly in the kind of like very powerful planters in lowland North Carolina, like whoa, slow down. Like we don't want these guys starting a war that we then have to pay for, come to their aid. Forget it. It's kind of same dynamic that helped fuel the Revolutionary War itself. So there's conflict out there, a couple shootouts, people killed. You've got on the kind of the South Carolina-Georgia border, groups of Maroons, African Americans who'd escaped slavery and were living in, along the Savannah River and, kind of like deep in the backlands. There's also Maroons in the Great Dismal Swamp, which is there's not much of it left, but that's on the border of North Carolina and Virginia. It was enormous at one time. And that was just a badlands that was just, state authority didn't really extend there for a very long time. And these Maroon colonies, particularly in the Georgia, South Carolina area, had been reinforced with former soldiers of the British Army. So one of the tactics that the British used in the Revolution was to encourage enslaved Africans to escape from slavery and join their forces. And they did this again during the War of 1812. And they would make contact and say, look, we'll be back in 2 weeks at this point, and bring everyone you can. We'll be here. You'll all be free. The men will train you and arm you. You'll have to fight, but you can bring your families. And so there were thousands of enslaved African Americans, and in some cases Africans, people who had been born in Africa, who escaped and joined the British Army. Became part of Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. Mm-hmm. Lord Dunmore also apparently, there's not much written about that. Only a few sources there were quite a few white indentured servants, who also escaped and went to the British lines. A lot of these British soldiers, these black British soldiers, evacuated with the British. They end up in what's now Nova Scotia, and then become the kind of founding settlers of Sierra Leone. But a lot of them were also left behind. It's not really clear how many, but maybe up to 1,500, 2,000. And so there are these reports of these British military veterans, black British military veterans out there in the Maroon communities, calling themselves the King of England soldiers, raiding, fighting. They had like these villages, like one raid they recounted there's like 100 canoes. It's like serious settlements of like armed, autonomous black people out there. And so the authorities in South Carolina are freaking out about this and demanding that something be done. There is also on the Kentucky, what becomes Kentucky, which is, early on is just part of Virginia. Another thing to keep in mind here is that all of the 13 colonies all had these exorbitant, insane land claims, right? They're just like, in this Notes on the State of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson describes Virginia. It's bounded by the Atlantic and this and that, and then it's just sort of like the western boundary isn't really there. It's just like and out. It's like goes out like as far as we can get, essentially. So what's now Kentucky was claimed by Virginia. There are squatters going out there resisting Virginian control, squatting on land that is claimed by people like George Washington. And these county governments are also running into conflict with Native Americans. The Ohio country, what's now Ohio, has been ceded by the British. And so this was the area where numerous Native American groups, particularly the Shawnee, lived. And they were traditionally, the Shawnee lived sort of north of the Kentucky River and hunted in Kentucky. And then, but so after the Revolution, this is all, open and being invaded by squatters, and there's increasing conflict. And so there are these Kentucky militias going into Ohio and raiding, and the Shawnee are fighting back. This will all eventually build up into the 1790s after the Constitution is ratified and the United States, as we currently know it to be formulated, exists. But what we're talking about now is still the critical period when the government is operating under the Articles of Confederation. So there's tit for tat, like vicious violence between Native Americans and white settlers on the western frontier. So this is the whole kind of panorama of violence during the critical period. And all of this is bearing down on Hamilton's imagination. And he's becoming increasingly concerned about those concerns, those worries he developed during the war when on Washington's staff. That, wait a minute, this whole thing is it has momentum, but it is not well organized, and it could very easily fall apart. There are external threats and there are internal threats. It is chaotic. And I mean, there are, to put it in modern language, right? There's class divisions, there are racial divisions, there are geographic divisions. It's just the fissures are enormous, and they're getting worse and worse and worse, in part because the economy is in the tank. I mean, it's
which doesn't allow them to have a strong army, which then doesn't allow them to have this sort of centralized decision-making ability. And
it also makes people desperate. I mean, people are ready
banditry
to steal their neighbor's land, in part because they're desperate. They're not busy happily with some secure piece of property, working on it, this or that, exploiting each other's labor and blah, 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 whatever. I mean, they're just being driven from these collapsed urban regional economies out into these frontiers where they bump into other settlers or Native Americans who don't want them there, or Maroons resisting the authority and this encroachment. So the whole thing is just primed for crisis.
Talk to us about Hamilton entering here, because he finds a sort of creative solution. He's trying to figure out how they can dampen the violence without going to all-out war here. He sort of enters the situation. Let me go back real quick. I want to find the part. You might know what I'm talking about, but there's a portion in.
He chills out. He brings peace to the whole Vermont-New York conflict.
Right.
Essentially telling, and he is married into a major New York family, the Schuyler's, and he tells his father-in-law, he gets his father-in-law to just recognize Vermont, to just say, that's gone, man. You guys got to just write that off.
Yeah.
That's a loss. This is ridiculous.
But he shows his political chops again. I mean, it's like over and over, like each chapter you're sort of showing like, here's a new context, a new set of challenges. Hamilton finds this way to sort of, to prove his worth, at least politically. He's making these decisions and oftentimes, of course, being successful in doing so. So let's go to chapter 8 in Shays Rebellion. We could round it out because I don't want to take too much of your time. But go ahead and if you want to say.
And one thing, I say this in the beginning of the book. One caveat is that I did not set out to write a hagiography of Hamilton, and the book is really mostly uses Hamilton as a kind of through line for this larger history, though he is really important to that history. But I also, even though I am critical of Jefferson's politics, I don't want to recapitulate what I have come to see as a sort of adolescent, like Hamilton versus Jefferson thing. When I first started reading about Hamilton, I kind of indulged in that for a moment, but then I realized that's sort of ridiculous. And I see no point also in sort of like siding with Hamilton or, venerating him too much, but rather to study him for what he achieved in this crisis, and not to romanticize him so much, but to just look at his projects.
And I'm not particularly interested in Hamilton as the individual, but what I find interesting about those exchanges doing the organizing and activist work isn't so much about Hamilton as himself, but just the decisions, the challenges, the types of things that we have to sort of encounter day in and day out. If you're doing political work, like that's what I find interesting, in other words, about him coming up with those creative, or nuanced, complex ways of like dealing with these issues that seem, insurmountable at the time, because we are often faced with some of the same things. So just to be clear as well, because I understand your point, and I want to make sure I'm not necessarily like romanticizing him as the individual, but I do find those sort of like interactions very useful, for us thinking strategically, or trying to think as strategically as we can at all times. All right, so let's go through quickly, or as quickly as you'd like to, Chapter 8, Shays Rebellion, the culmination of crises. This sort of brings us up to the Constitutional Convention, which the way I've read so far is sort of like two parts of the book. I don't want to say that if that's not the case, but it's like, here's the context leading to Hamilton now being on the nation stage, making decisions, really directing the the direction of the country, where it's going to go, how it's going to be.
There's definitely some turning point here with Shays Rebellion. The culmination of the critical period then becomes, there is also one other ingredient in this that is, dare I say, I think, totally original to this book, is to read climate back into the critical period. So
yes.
Part of what goes on is that you've got the 1785 tax requisition, the $40 million request from Congress, and the states start squeezing blood from a stone in late 85 and into 86. But there's also been a massive volcanic eruption in Iceland in 1783 and 84. This is Loki is the name of the volcano. And if you go to Iceland ever, which I had the opportunity, was invited to the university there, and there's this volcano. It's not a mountain. It's actually kind of like this lava flows that built out a portion of the sea was filled in by lava, and it's a sort of like plain. But anyway, so this eruption goes on for a long time, and it produces a cooling of the climate in the northern hemisphere. And this shows up in New England and throughout much of the Northeast as cold and wet summers. There's very serious flooding in the spring of 86. It's been a really bad winter. So it takes a while for the volcano begins at 83 through 85. I think it's like spewing out all through like 84. So it's like the cooling effect is really starting to kick in 1785, 86, and the taxes, the great tax requisition that I rely on Woody Holton, who really deserves props. He's a fantastic historian who wrote a nice and funny blurb for the book. Really brought the 1785 tax requisition to everyone's attention. So in New England, you've got this disastrous weather. You've got these floods that are washing away barns, failed crops, and this insane tax campaign. And the tax, the debts are owed. The debt is owed by, it's like, a large percentage owned by like 35 families on the coast around Boston. And they are extracting everything they can from the interior of the state. And it is amidst this that a kind of a tax rebellion starts. And nowadays, tax rebellion connotes as kind of like Koch-funded right-wing bullshit. But I mean, these are just desperate farmers who, what happens is that, they can't pay their taxes, in part because there is the worst depression, one of the worst depressions in American history, equal to the Great Depression, right? So like you can produce a crop, but you can't sell it for very much money because there's just not that much demand. There's too much supply and prices are declining. You've got deflation. So they can't get the money they need to pay these taxes. There's this terrible weather hammering people. In many cases, they can't produce. If they can produce, they can't sell. They're losing their resources. And the courts, the bailiffs, are foreclosing on farmers who can't meet their tax obligations. And so the farmers of central and western Massachusetts start organizing to confront the bailiffs and to stop these foreclosures. And they also just shut down the courts. They organize and mobilize and come into these towns where the courts are and just shut them down. Just tell the judges to leave, bar the courts, tell the lawyers and the judges to get out of here. There's going to be no procedures. And this becomes increasingly violent. And this is also going on in New Hampshire, a little bit in Connecticut as well. So they start arming, and they in August of 1786, there's now about like 1,500 of these armed regulators. This is an old sort of term that goes back to the regulator tradition in the U.S. is a weird thing. It's like half class rebel, half vigilante, nasty local kind of like extra legal terror. And in the backcountry of the Carolinas in the 1740s is where the regulator movement and that term comes from. And so the Shaysites don't call themselves Shaysites, they call themselves regulators. And they're kind of trying to restore the old order. And in this case, they are going up against the courts and the tax authorities. And the state can't allow this, so they start pushing back, sending in armed sheriffs, and there's more and more violence, and it's clear, and they call out the militia to put an end to this armed protest, and the militias muster and then dissolve away, or sometimes they have conflicts and they're beaten or scattered by the Shaysites. On a couple of occasions, they muster and find out what they're supposed to do, and they switch sides. So the state militia isn't working. So the elites in Boston come up with impose a kind of private tax, a subscription on themselves, and they raise some money, and they hire a Revolutionary War veteran to organize essentially a private army made up mostly of young men who did not fight in the Revolution. And they then march out to, crush this rebellion. And the final conflict in all this is that the Shayites, as all this is heating up, they realize they need more weapons, and this is now we're into late January, early February of 1786, and the Shayites are gonna, and it's a harsh winter, right? Because there's this kind of cooling pattern because of the Laki volcano, and they're gonna attack the armory at Springfield, Massachusetts, and this private army, unfortunately, marches through the snow. I guess to their military credit, this general, I forget his name exactly. He's a minor character in American history, or whatever. He marches his forces like through the night, and they catch the Shayites unaware, in the middle of the night in a snowstorm, and there's a battle, and they scatter them and they beat them. But then there's, all through the spring, there's violence. And a lot of the Shayites, so these regulators, the Western Mass regulators, flee into Vermont, where they are welcomed by the powers that be in Vermont, which is to say Ethan Allen and the characters around him, Governor Chittenden. So officially, Vermont says we're not going to accept these rebels, blah, 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 blah. But actually, they welcome them in and they give them sanctuary. Some of them flee into New York. But all through the spring, there's arrests are being made, arrests are being resisted, barns are being burned, people are being shot at, there are being night letters. It's like, the moment of sort of force on force military conflict is over, and it turns into this sort of low boil, terrorist guerrilla conflict where it's like the indebted farmers are, terrorizing their enemies with threats and occasional violence. And this is the culmination of the critical period. This really drives home to the political class that the Articles of Confederation are not going to work, and that something has to be done. And these ideas that Hamilton has been pushing, and it's not just Hamilton, James Madison is extremely important in all this, but there has been, in the summer prior to this, there has been an effort to convene all of the representatives from all of the states are convened in Annapolis, and the explicit reason for this is to deal with sort of trade war between Virginia and Maryland, trying to work out some interstate commerce, because this is, and not enough representatives show up. So the Annapolis conference is a dud, but they agree to meet again the next year. So the Continental Congress, the Constitutional Convention, begins literally as Shays Rebellion is being mopped up.
And some of those mop-up operations, I don't want to get too much into this because that's a really good place to end, because then we'll go into the next half next week. But some of those mop-up operations, I know they're described as sort of guerrilla warfare as well. Some of it sounds like what we would today call counterinsurgency. I mean, to some degree, you've got folks moving through these small towns, probably seen as an occupying force. You have people, locals, who are sort of resisting this, some of whom are, probably neutral as well, obviously. This, of course, is a turning point for Hamilton. And I just want to end by sort of getting you to talk about how, for Hamilton, once again, there's this need for centralization, but he sees these problems not as like being on their own, but that, I think one of the quotes, I don't want to look back or I might be able to find it, but nonetheless, he sort of describes that if Shays wouldn't have been in so much debt, that this wouldn't have happened, that this was a direct result of this inability to have this kind of economic sovereignty and power and coordination that would allow, for some development and so forth. So this was truly like a pivotal moment for him. And you even write that this is a recurring reference in Hamilton's Federalist essays as well.
Yeah, I got the quote here for you. So to Hamilton, Shays Rebellion was a harbinger of total disintegration, an object lesson in what we would today call state failure. Hamilton saw the root cause of the critical period's turmoil as fundamentally economic. as he wrote in Federalist number 6, if Shays had not been a desperate debtor, it is much to be doubted whether Massachusetts would have been plunged into civil war.
Yep.
So yeah, and it is no coincidence that the last mop-up operations of Shays Rebellion are going on in May 1787 as the Constitutional Convention is gathering in Philadelphia. Because prior to that, they couldn't get a quorum. But at that point where it's like, wow, this is like an ongoing shooting war has erupted in Massachusetts. And finally, all the states' rights people realize, wait a minute, something has to be done or this project is going to disintegrate.
And we will pick up on the second half of the book next week. Christian, I thank you for this. Greatly appreciate it. For taking the time, being patient with us. I probably took an hour beyond what I told you I would take. Sergio's given me the evil eye because the amount of editing that will have to happen now is beyond what I can do. We have like a really strict capitalist division of labor right now. We hope to change some of that as time goes on, but fuck. Christian Parenti is Associate Professor of Economics at John Jay College, City University of New York, author of Lockdown America, The Soft Cage, Tropic of Chaos, and his most recent book, which is forthcoming from Verso, Radical Hamilton. Christian, thanks for coming. We appreciate it. This is Park Media. I've been your host, Vince Emanuele. Thanks for watching. Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parkmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Park Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.